Good Shabbos. We just finished Yom Kippur, and hopefully all of us have completely eradicated all of our sinful behavior. But now I'd like to let you in on a little secret. There's a passage in the Talmud that says there's such a thing as an Aveira Lishma, a sin which is for the sake of heaven or for a good reason, and that seems to be allowed. The case that they talk about is Yael, who's a woman who meets Sisera, who's running away from Devorah after Devorah's army obliterates the enemy, and he finds himself going to the tent of this woman, Yael, and she allows him in, and as the story unfolds in the prophet, she kills him. And the Talmud says that there's a passage afterwards when Devorah sings the praises, and she says that he fell between her feet, between Yael's feet, and somehow the Talmud understands that means that she actually had relations with him. And she was a married woman, and that's forbidden. But the Talmud understands that she did it in order to weaken him and seduce him, so she would be able to kill him. And they call that an Aveira Lishma. We also have a very similar idea where the Talmud says that Penina, L'Shem Shemayim Nischavnu, Penina, who's the co-wife of Chana, and it says she gets her angry, V'chiasata Tzarasa, she gets her co-wife very angry. She did it in order to make Chana pray, to get her angry and upset and distressed enough that she would pray to God and she would be answered. So again, it seems that you're not supposed to distress someone, you're not supposed to get them angry, you're not supposed to make fun of them. And she did it though, l'shem shemayim, for the sake of heaven. She did it for a good reason. So those are two cases. Now there's also another idea of hara asha, a temporary dispensation. When something is needed and it's out of the ordinary and it might go against what's normally considered the halacha, the law, it's sometimes allowed, but only under certain conditions. The classical case is Elijah. He brings a offering outside of the temple, which is forbidden, but he does this in order to compete with the idol worshippers and to show that God answers his prayers and a fire comes down to heaven and consumes his offering. And that doesn't happen with the pagan idolaters who he's competing with. And we're told that since Elijah is a prophet, he has the right to have a temporary dispensation made against the normal laws. And we understand that's not only true by a prophet, but it's understood that is also true by a Sanhedrin, the high court, the great court that sat in the temple. They were allowed to also sometimes change the law only on a temporary basis, never on a permanent basis. And from this, we get the idea that even though we have very set commandments and obligations and restrictions, sometimes you're allowed to be a little bit more flexible under certain conditions. Now, Maimonides actually says in one of his writings that he talks about this idea of Aveira Lishma, sometimes doing a sin for the sake of heaven. And one of the commentaries there, more modern commentaries, says, he was referring to hara asha, this temporary dispensation that's done by a court or a prophet. But when you read Maimonides carefully, he's not talking about that. And here words I think might be a little relevant to us. What he seems to be saying is he talks about going down the golden mean, the middle path in all character traits. And I've talked about this other times. Maimonides adopts Aristotle's idea of the golden mean from the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, and he focuses a lot on that both in some of his writings on the Mishnah and also in his Code of Jewish Law. But one of the things he says is that we have to adopt our behavior. So if we find ourselves going to one extreme or the other, we have to balance that out by going to the opposite extreme and hopefully eventually coming down back to the middle. So one of his examples is, if you find yourself giving away too much money, you're giving away too much charity, which you're not supposed to do because you're not supposed to impoverish yourself. You always have to keep a certain amount for yourself to make sure you will survive and you can support your family. Excuse me. He says that if you find yourself doing that, which is not the problem with most people have the opposite problem, then you should go to the opposite extreme and not give any money out. And make sure that you basically train yourself not to be too giving. And it's the opposite also. If you're completely not giving, you should give away a lot of charity until you train yourself and educate yourself in giving charity. But both are forbidden. You're not supposed to give too much unless you could really afford it, and you're not supposed to give too little. So Maimonides says, though, that's how you train yourself. And I believe that's what Maimonides means when he says you should do an Aveira Lishma, you do a sin for the sake of heaven. This goes back to a theme I've been talking about recently, which is that the mitzvahs, the commandments, are not just set rituals. They're not just very strict laws. They are that. We have to follow them, but there's a spirit behind the law. There's a concept there. There's an ideal. There's something we're striving for. We're trying to create certain personality traits. We're trying to make ourselves more perfect and trying to emulate God. And what Maimonides, I think, is saying is that you can't always do that by going strictly by the letter of the law. We have to, as a rabbi, for example, you can't actually tell people to go against the law. It's just like a judge has to follow the law, and police have to make sure to make sure that people follow the law as it's given. That's our obligation on a societal level. Because as soon as you start opening up and being more flexible, it's a slippery slope. But on an institutional level, when the Sanhedrin, when the High Court or the Prophet knows these are exceptional people and they can make that decision, they're able to make that decision because everyone knows it's only them. But what Maimonides seems to be saying is that on an individual level, you can't necessarily tell people, oh, you could do this and you could do that. But it's obvious, I think, to all of us that the law, the mitzvah, is not always specifically going to help in every particular situation. So you have to be able to gauge that sometimes you have to be a little flexible. Again, it's a dangerous path to take, and I only speak about this after Yom Kippur. But the idea is that we have to understand that there's a spirit of the law. We have to understand that we shouldn't always just look at it as something as a burden. The law, the mitzvahs, the commandments, our obligations, our rituals are all there for a greater goal, a greater purpose. And when we understand that, we understand when we should be a little flexible and maybe changing our behavior and when we shouldn't. Again, you can't take advantage of this. You can't rationalize it to the degree where the law, where the mitzvahs, where our ethics and morals just fall by the wayside. But by understanding that, at least in theory, this is possible, we start to hopefully identify with that which is behind the mitzvahs, the ideals, the goals, the emulation of God, creating good character. And I think that's what we have to do. Now that Yom Kippur is over, we move in that direction and we understand that our lives have to be devoted to constantly perfecting ourselves. Good Shabbos.